Educator Curtis Acosta in Tucson had a passion for closing the achievement gap between Mexican American students and white students in a high school. His story of how he achieved that is an amazing one. It's also amazing the problems that came from the Arizona legislature after that. But here's the core thing I want you to remember, that he integrated the Mexican American ethnic studies into the core classes of the high school, and that is what made the difference. It was a very, very successful program, tracked over 7 years. So please enjoy this video and meet Curtis Acosta.
I love chile rellenos, right? But I can't eat them much anymore. So because the blood tests are chile relleno, like they're combating. But you take a chile and you stuff it with cheese and you dip it in an egg batter and you fry that up. That is like nirvana for me, and it's also some dishes from my youth, my abuelita and my tias, as well as chicken mole. So a mole sauce, which is a chile sauce, but also has chocolate. It's decadent. It's unbelievable. So those are my sins. And if I get on the treadmill and or just want to live a little wildly, that's what I would suggest people have to give a shot if they're going to listen to this interview. Have some chile relleno or some chicken mole. I grew up in California in mostly the 70s and 80s, and I come from a biracial family. So my mom's of European descent, my dad's of Mexican American descent, and both multiple generations here in the United States, and so I think it took me a long time to realize that my parents were kind of trailblazers because they got married in 1965. So a Chicano man and a European American, people call white. I don't like to call my mom a color in a crayon box, but that was ahead of the times. It took me took my 20s to really reflect upon that. My mid 20s, probably after I started teaching and really confronting issues of race. I went back to my own family history and was I was really shocked that I hadn't thought of that before. But I think that really formulated a lot of who I became, because we didn't have terms for us when I was a kid. The idea of being biracial, that's a very cool and hip term, multiracial now. And I'm very happy that young people now who are like myself have those terms, because there wasn't either formal language about who we were, or it was all derogatory. It was we're mixed or halfies or worse. And it's a difficult time because the country wasn't really set up to have that kind of consciousness towards who we were as young people. So we were you either weren't brown enough or you weren't white enough, depending on what context you were in. And I think that impacted me in a way where I was always listening to make sure I knew how people were speaking about race and ethnicity before I could feel comfortable. It certainly didn't help that all my cousins and myself growing up in the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s, none of us have Spanish. It was part of that language erasure model. So none of us could speak Spanish, so that added to the distance from feeling our Mexican American roots. At the same time, the brown skin's on the outside, so there was this reticence to embrace us in any other way. I think that helped me as a teacher to have that background and to have those difficulties, because I think many young people feel inadequate. I mean, it's part of our process growing up, or feel alienated or marginalized, especially youth of color in this country, especially poor youth, especially LGBTQ youth. So any youth that have been, marginalized in some way through the history of this country. I think that allowed me to have that empathy and understanding. It put me in a good spot to be a teacher. So because it also helped me always check that nasty thing we do as human beings, which is judge somebody by what they look like. Because I'm surprising to a lot of people. There's a lot of assumptions that are made about who I am, and so by living that, it made it easier for me to not do that same nasty habit and practice, which is to project what I think upon youth and to learn who they are authentically. Because that's what I wanted. I wanted a space. None of my teachers growing up would ever very rarely would tap into who I was as a young Mexican American kid growing up or a biracial kid growing up. They wouldn't approach it, and so I never wanted that, because if somebody doesn't approach it, then who's gonna, of a teacher especially, and elders don't approach it with young people, then where are we gonna learn? How do we really learn about who we are? Usually from media. And mainstream media is not the best way to learn about who you are as a person, especially the images I saw of being Mexican growing up. It was a real honor to design classes that were going to reflect the students within them and their history, the stories, their culture, their lived experiences now. And that's what we did. We did it through literature, we did it through social studies, we did it through art. And what ended up happening is the students found themselves, they were able to release themselves from any mainstream internalized oppressive type of experiences or thoughts about being Latino, which I was alluding to growing up. There's a bunch of real derogatory imagery out there about what it means to be Latino, and a lot of derogatory language, derogatory educational practices, within our history books and within our in the lack of Chicana, Latino, Latina authors. Just having a dearth of voices, of multicultural voices, of just multiple voices in general, that fit our nation's, the way the nation is built, and who's contributed to this wonderful nation. Having an absence of that says a lot. We learn as much from what's not there as we do sometimes from what is there. So what we wanted to do was build experience that was going to correct that, and was going to allow students to have those opportunities to see themselves and to grow from there too. It wasn't dogmatic in any way. It was led by the students. So if we found a project the students were going through, for instance, they wanted a positive representation of youth on their campus, we built something beautiful like the Unity Festival, which was a all-day hip-hop cultural event where students would go on stage, read spoken word poems, spit their own flow, rap. We would do graffiti art. We would have workshops on cultural, some historical workshops, cultural workshops of many different ethnicities. Whatever the flavor of the students wanted, they produced it. They wrote the grants. They communicated with the politicians and with the local, the city parks and recreation folks to get the stage and the booths and all those wonderful things. They ran it. They had a budget. They had meetings. They had committees. They brought in the talent from all over the nation to also headline and perform, so that to even make it a more grand event. And that was the type of empowerment our program was about. That's the kind of leadership we were about, which was guiding more than leading, which was cultivating the students' sense of agency and empowerment. And what we found, and then we got the educational outcomes went through the roof. Students were graduating, in the high 90% from all of our high schools that we taught at. We had they were passing the tests. They were doing great in math, even though we didn't teach math, And it just, once our students saw themselves as scholars and as human beings, then the world in Tucson was a better place for it. And unfortunately, that program became demonized and vilified during a real ugly time in Arizona politics in the late 2000s and specifically the legislative session of 2010. So 3 legislative attempts were made, and the third and final one, 3 legislative attempts were made to eliminate our program. The third and final one was in 2010 during the same legislative session as SB 1070, which became the Papers, Please law, which is still in effect here. And so HB 2281 was what they call the anti-ethnic studies law, which really wasn't necessarily about anti-ethnic studies. It was about many other things. It was most specifically a law built, specifically written for our tiny program. At our height, we were 3,000 students, and if you look at the whole demographics of the state, we're way less than 1% of the students of this state. And with all those positive educational outcomes, all those positive human outcomes, you would think that would be a program replicated, and it became a program that was vilified in January of 2012, dismantled.
Wow. And this was after 7-year tracking of a very successful outcome.
Yeah, year after year. It started like 1 year, 2 years of tracking, because actually our own district, they were reticent to think that we were doing that type of success. And I'll never forget that the Accountability and Research Department, after running their first study, it was like our first 2 years of the program, in our effectiveness, they apologized to our directors. They said to them, we didn't think you were about this rigorous type of academic work. And I think that says a lot. And so they said, we're sorry, because you're doing amazing work. And I think that mainstream ideology is out there towards ethnic studies. It's historical. It's handed down from one generation to the next. We're talking about 40, 50 years now of ethnic studies in this country. San Francisco State was the first university to offer ethnic studies in the late 60s. And what you see is that people want to take away the academic rigor behind it, which is a subtle form of discrimination and racism. Or maybe it's not so subtle, but it's certainly there. There's this feeling that this type of history is somehow not, it doesn't reach some level of seriousness. And anybody that knows the unbelievable work of the last, most of this world isn't of European descent. So most of the history of this globe is not of European descent. And to discount a concentrated study of that type of those experiences is discounting most of the history of this globe. So it's ahistorical, and it's non-academic in thinking. But there is that same type of feeling that folks have towards affirmative action and other types of programs that are built to rectify historical trauma and institutional racism, institutional discriminatory practices. There's that same kind of reticency, or same type of view that these things don't reach the heights of something that comes from a more traditional European construct. And what people need to understand is European American history is ethnic studies. So this benign or objective type of schooling that we've all received, and I never received any ethnic studies that was not of a European vintage. We've always done this. And what we were about in our program is to create a more complex and more, and by making a more complex and more holistic view of education. By doing that, you make it more human. And if you make it more human, it's going to reflect the different human beings that are taking part in that practice of learning. And we were successful, but unfortunately, we were also later banned from doing it. So it came at a price. Well, what was awesome about our story is that it was multi-generational. So you had the folks that came before us that are still active in this community, what I call the veteranas and veteranos, the abuelitas and abuelitos, that generation of civil rights leaders in our country, in our town here in Tucson. They walked with us, and our students did too. And so when we're more of the parents' vintage, right? So the same years. So you had these 3 generations of support, and I think that made it some of the most beautiful times that I've ever lived, because it wasn't just a wedge issue. It wasn't just for a certain group. It was literally an entire community through generations that saw the value in what we were doing. And before it was please help save our program, it was actually our students were very active, and they're the ones that should take credit for our program growing, because they would go to the school board meetings every other week for years. This lasted 7-8 years. They would go, and it started first with them saying, them and their parents, we need classes more like this. I've never been more engaged. My little brothers and sisters need these classes, but they need them earlier. Expand the program. It was all about that language. We need more resources. Our teachers are always bringing in photocopies. We want books, because we weren't getting books at that time. We were still being treated like back of the bus by some of the higher ups at our school sites, or even in the administration of the district. So finally, through that type of activism, our program grew. Our students petitioned for the classes. They went to site-based committees and spoke to the principals and administrators at sites, spoke to the administrators at the district level. And during those times, we actually had superintendents that were from Tucson, and they saw the beauty of what was going on. They invested in our students. And then after a while, the state started learning about what we were doing, and they came down on us. And then our students shifted into, defend our program. Say something, demanding our district publicly support us. And then finally, the last phase was save our program, and we did. I mean, through all those phases were multiple years, many different cohorts of students, which shows you how it's another measure of how we were successful. We would get students at the junior and senior levels, first time they ever had us, and within a year they would find their voice and their agency to want to make sure that this legacy lived on. It wasn't like the same students for 8 years. It was different students, different cohorts of students coming through, because they matriculate, they graduate, and they go off, and blessedly they went off to college and got a lot of scholarship opportunities to do so. Some of our students not so much, but we're still real active in the community and really active in supporting what we were doing. And those have there are different implications because of that. Many times we got our students too late. I wouldn't say too late, but too late to change the courses they would have taken their freshman and sophomore years if they would have had better guidance. And then they weren't eligible to go to the University of Arizona or a 4-year university, so they had to engage in the community college level. And sometimes that was really deflating for them, because they had found their scholarly voice, and it felt like higher education didn't want them. Mm-hmm. All because of earlier mistakes, earlier projections of what those students were. Kind of what I talked about earlier about seeing a student for what you think they are, instead of really learning what they are and tapping into what they can be. So those are all of the ways that our students, their parents, this community, the elders in our community, all walked with each other, side by side, We're eliminated. These classes they have a death date, and that was January 10th of 2012. The program's been dismantled, and it's been very clear from our district officials, even though we have new district officials now, so there's some optimism, but the district officials back in 2012 were very clear that we did not have a home, and that we were going to be banned from all of the curriculum that we created. And so I taught for a year teaching without my curriculum, and it was one of the more painful things I've ever had to do. And it's also malpractice, because what I was doing and what my colleagues and I were doing was the highest level, some of the highest levels of education those students were ever going to experience. And instead I had to give them something that was much more remedial, I had much less connection to it. They were putting me back in a box where I was a first-year teacher again. They were chilling our First Amendment voice in the classroom. We didn't feel comfortable. How could you, when you had a state takeover of your class? And they would check on you. You know, this was a literal, like the tanks come rolling in. So we were, that program is now in a store. For me, it's in storage over off of Ajo Way, down here in South Tucson. You know, my class I had to box up and put away. But the beautiful part now is other places across the country want to know what we did. Because of the unprecedented success with Latino youth. And this country is getting more and more Latino by the day. And just started my business of trying to share this information, do professional development with teaching as an education consultant. I started my own firm. It's called the Acosta Latino Learning Partnership. And I've started working with some school districts. I just came back from Milwaukee, some amazing educators there. And I'm hoping to start these, make these connections and continue these partnerships. I'm working in California. California just passed a ethnic studies policy for their schools. Texas has just passed a Mexican American studies policy for their schools. They need to be, right now they're electives. They need to be core credits, like our classes were core credits, because they deserve to be core credits. Our students were writing essays and doing projects that were, college level. I mean, because that's the only model we had. So, and that's another thing that made our program unique was the fact that it was not only rooted in indigenous epistemology, so it's rooted in the teachings of this pre-Columbian experience in this country. There's things we can learn from the Aztec sunstone. There's things we can learn from the Maya writings and the codices that we used in the classroom, like the concept of in lakesh, tu eres mi otro yo, you are my other me. That principle of we should do everything for each other, with each other. Those were the principles in our classroom that I think that made us unique. But at the same time, our curriculum was also unique because there aren't ethnic studies textbooks for high school teachers out there. We had to craft everything, and most of the time we crafted from our college experiences. So our students were getting a college preparatory program while they were achieving this high level of academic success. So that's what we want to replicate around the country, and we also want to make sure that administrations and people that form education policy in this country treat these classes and treat this type of study and treat this type of education with the sincerity and the earnestness that it deserves, and that is to give it full high school credit for college and not just be marginalized as an elective. And because electives go away, they come and they go at the whim of a lot of people. But history class and English class, they're rooted in schools, K-12. So and that's what our students need, and we've proven that. And so we're hoping to go around. I'm hoping to work with as many people as possible. Although it can be tiring at times, but it's inspiring once I'm there, because it's a way for our program to live on and to really help the future of this country deal humanely and respectfully with the academic and educational potential of Latino students.